Good evening. I'd like to call to order the special meeting of the CUSD 303 School Board. It is July 22nd, 2021, and it is 5:01. And before we call roll, I would like to let everyone know that Mrs. Weibel is not present due to illness, and Mrs. Bell is connecting with us via Zoom due to a family emergency. Okay, Ms. Marcian, the roll, please.
Mrs. Bell,
Yes.
Mrs. Fairgrieve,
Here.
Mr. Lackner,
Here.
Mrs. McCabe,
Here.
Mr. McNally,
Here.
Miss Weibel's absent, and Mrs. Barker.
Here. Please stand for the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Okay, we have a few citizens' comments this evening. Mrs. McCabe, would you please read the citizens' comments policy?
The school code provides for a public comment period at each board meeting, subject to reasonable constraints. Practice of this board is to limit public comment to 3 minutes per speaker to a total of 30 minutes per meeting. Speakers addressing the board are expected to maintain a reasonable level of civility. Also, personnel matters are sensitive and confidential. Comments regarding individuals should be respectful. Insults and defamatory remarks have no place in this setting. The board will terminate public comment if speakers cannot adhere to these guidelines. Please identify yourself at the beginning of your remarks.
Okay, and our first speaker is Scott Norris.
Please bear with me, Scott Norris. I know it's not necessarily going to be on topic for what the board is here to meet today, but I wasn't able to have any say the other day when we met. So as a parent of not to be fourth grader and sixth grader, I wanted to share my concerns and put the politics aside and try to put the emotions aside and actually ask for a compromise on the stuff that's been going on. I know there was already a vote, but I figured I would ask anyway. So a couple points I wanted to make that I took snapshots of is we just had a town hall based on our current administration that did outline a vaccine plan for those 11 and younger based on Pfizer and based on Moderna. It's looking at the end of August to begin of September with potentially as late as October to have a rollout, which is great news for families that are in the situation that I am. Now, obviously, there will be time for the rollout, time to get appointments, time to get shots in the arms. So we have to keep that in consideration. The second thing is I also went and looked at what our districts are doing that we're not doing, and U46, which is our area, has decided to have K through 6 continue to be masked. Now, I know we have a lot of people on both sides. Some don't want anybody to mask, some want everybody to mask. I apologize for my phone. I'm here to actually ask for the compromise. We have 4 months, basically, that we got to deal with our K through 6 kids not having the ability to have that final option. I'm not asking for the high schoolers who've already been through enough. They're young adults, let them make their own decision with their parents. They can come to that. I was going to ask for 7th and 8th graders because they will be around my daughter in 6th grade, but I'm not even willing to go that far. We're supposed to be teaching them and preparing them, so allow them to also have those decisions with their family. However, my daughter doesn't get a choice. My daughter is going to be in a closed room. I don't know how we're going to do 3 feet, but she's going to be in a closed room with kids that may or may not be wearing masks. My daughters were super excited to go back to school this year because we kept them remote last year because we didn't know. Neither of them want to go back into the class, and I don't want them back in there either. But after I read what U46 is doing and given how close we are to them and how many students they have and are willing to do it, especially the superintendent there, publicly commenting on it, I'm really hoping that we can go back and reconsider. We still have like 3 weeks or so until school starts. So I'll leave it at that. It's something in the middle. I think it appeases both sides. You give some flexibility in the masking. You don't give any until we have vaccines. It's not much more time. And we were stellar last year. We didn't have any major outbreaks in our schools. Coron alone had 16 emails sent out, 22 cases, and yet we did not have an outbreak. So if we are able to manage it and the kids were able to manage it for 9 months, asking for another 2 to 3 months, I don't think they're going to say no. They're looking for our guidance. So that's my piece. And thank you for listening.
Thank you. The next name, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing this correctly. I think I am not. Shaini Bieber? Jean, okay.
Speaking about the same thing, but I have a little piece that I wrote. The American Academy of Pediatrics said Tuesday that COVID cases among children have nearly doubled since the end of June. With this significant increase, the AAP released new guidance Monday before the board meeting recommending universal masking in schools for everyone aged 2 and older, regardless of vaccination status. The AAP's guidance is stricter than the CDC, which recommends masks be worn inside by anyone 2 and older and not fully vaccinated. District 303 sent the link for these recommendations saying they're following them when in fact they are not. Nowhere in any of these recommendations are the words, masks should be optional. The head of the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention stressed the need for all of us to take this virus and its threat to children seriously. CDC Director Dr. Rochelle Walensky said, and I quote, "I think we fall into this flawed thinking of saying that only 400 of 600,000 deaths from COVID have been children. Children are not supposed to die. So 400 is a huge amount for the respiratory season." Dr. Walensky was referring to last season when our children were masking in schools. With masking and distancing last year, we were able as a school district to prevent the spread of this disease within our schools. Listen, we all want to be done with masking so we can see each other smile again. I believe there should be exceptions to our masking policy. In the case of one-on-one speech therapy, for example, if the adult specialist is vaccinated and protected from infection. We're talking about our children here, the future of our nation. In Mississippi right now, 13% of their critical cases are children. Critical cases, children on the edge of life and death, enduring one of the scariest things to happen in their lives all alone. These children belong to people, their grandchildren, sisters, brothers, cousins, nieces, dying of a completely preventable illness. Dying because we have people in our own community turning public health and safety into an individual rights debate. We're smarter than that here. We can listen to scientists and doctors who've studied communicable diseases. We can hear them when they tell us that if we continue to allow this disease to spread by not vaccinating and not masking, we will create variants that could be completely immune to our new vaccines, putting us right back in the same position we were in 2020. In closing, I will say this. If there's one thing I know, it's that I live in a community of people who adore their children. Please help us protect them from this very preventable illness by masking and social distancing. Our children are our entire world. We should not play Russian roulette with their lives.
Thank you. The next speaker is Sarah Petro.
I'm also here to talk about masking and take this off while I'm talking here. Okay, according to District 303's website, and I'm quoting from the website, "It is the responsibility of District 303 to care for and protect our most valuable resource, children. In order for teachers to effectively teach and for students to learn, we must provide safe and secure learning environments, which is the responsibility of all district and school personnel," unquote. So please explain to me how making masking optional in our classrooms for our small children helps the district accomplish this self-stated goal. I was shocked to hear that the issue of mandatory masks was even up for debate at all. And to be honest with you, I was sickened when I heard that the school board voted unanimously to make it optional. Our children are taught in schools all the time, stand up to bullies, do the right thing, even when it was the hard thing to do. And they're taught to follow the scientific method, to read scientific textbooks, collecting evidence-based data on which to draw conclusions. And yet, it feels to me like our school board has decided not to stand up and do what's right for our kids, and has decided to disregard the clear evidence showing that masks work, which is the same evidence that was used to convince us it was safe to send our kids to school in the first place last year. It doesn't make any sense. Nothing has changed for those children. Implementing a mask mandate would demonstrate that you have the emotional medical, and mental health of all families within your district in mind. It would show that you care about everyone in our community, including the angry parents, as your actions would help stop the spread and mutation of COVID-19. Despite the clear recommendations from the CDC and the American Academy of Pediatrics that children should wear masks because they are unvaccinated and they don't have the opportunity yet to be vaccinated, you've chosen to listen to a small but loud group of angry community members. It's irresponsible and it's irrational. And if families in this district are against masks, so against masks that they would make t-shirts and show up to intimidate you into this decision, then they should be the ones making the decision to keep their kid home from school or to send them, not the rest of us who just want to see the most basic of safety measures, a mask in place to ensure a safe return to school for our kids. So I am asking you as a district, as a school board, to please reconsider the decision to make masking optional until all children are able to be vaccinated. At which point I would feel safe sending my daughter to school and my son fully vaccinated. But until then, it feels like I'm taking a huge risk with their lives, which just, it doesn't feel worth it to me. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker, Paul Woods.
Thank you for your time. Thank you for your work. I know this is a thankless job in the best of times and much more difficult right now. So I'd like to say thank you to everyone on the board and the administration. We all appreciate it. I'm the parent of 3 children in District 303, none of which are currently eligible for a vaccine yet. We chose, like one of the other speakers earlier today, to keep our children in remote last year, specifically because we wanted to keep them safe. That was number one. This was a difficult choice. This was a difficult task to execute for the district, for the teachers, for the remote learners, for everyone. That made it possible for those that chose to go in person last year to implement the 6-foot social distancing. When combined with masking, it was phenomenally successful in this district. The reduction to 3-foot social distancing makes it possible for everyone to go back to school this year within the facilities that we have. But the success of 3-foot or 6-foot social distancing is predicated on the assumption that everyone is wearing the mask or that they are vaccinated. So I implore you, like the others that have commented today, to reconsider. I've submitted detailed comments in writing to the board. I wanted to come here today to speak to you directly and to state the questions that I asked in a condensed form. Specifically, during the presentation on Monday, you went from, here's the guidance from all the professionals that say masking is effective, masking is strongly recommended, and then you immediately jump to, and therefore we're going to make it optional. There was no elaboration, there was no justification, there was no explanation to the parents to say why this board was choosing to disregard that guidance that was so successful last year. So what I'm asking specifically is that the board expand on how this decision was made and why, including the specific reasons why it was decided to remove a literal layer of protection from the unvaccinated individuals within these schools. You didn't tell us why you did that. You just said we're doing it because we don't have to. And again, other districts, larger districts, have chosen what is admittedly a more difficult choice to face the ire of those who disagree. And I respect those people. Everybody's entitled to their opinion. Everybody's entitled to voice their concerns, and they're not always going to be the same as mine. Okay? So I understand that. And again, I respect everybody is given the chance to speak here. And that was, I think, a more difficult in the last meeting. And I appreciate and hope that we stay the same way here today. I had some additional questions about the optional screening program, specifically that you're going to use people who have opted into the screening program as a way to say a staff or a teacher who is not vaccinated can go unmasked if they're in the screening program. And it's a weekly screening program, but there's no details regarding the timing of, how quickly you get a response to a test. And we all know, based on the published data, that, okay. So I've asked for follow-up from my questions in writing, but I want to know if the board considered the timing aspects of the screening program when deciding that a screen is
Mr. Woods,
okay
your
to
time
limit.
is up. Thank you.
Thank you.
Next speaker, Jill Sullivan.
Hi, I'm Jill Sullivan. I'm parent of 2 children at Wild Rose. I'm also speaking on the mask issue, but with a twist, with the fact that you're not going to change your current stance. I'm here today to propose an alternative option to elementary students and parents for this upcoming school year, since masks are now optional. First, I want to say how disappointed I am that masks are not going to be required for children 11 and under, even though they are highly recommended by CDC, IDPH, and the Academy of Pediatrics. I feel this decision did not put our children's safety first. Masking, along with the other multi-layer controls, was effective last year and the reason why our numbers in our schools stayed so low. I was trusting the same protocols would be in place for this school year until a vaccine becomes available for children 11 and under. With the Delta variant spreading, I am now worried COVID cases will increase in our schools, and I do not want my children to become sick from COVID when we are so close to having a vaccine available for them. As things have opened up this summer, I have observed many children not wearing masks in indoor spaces in various places. I feel this is what it will happen when school starts. As a parent, I have chosen not to take my children into these indoor spaces to keep them safe. And now the school board has taken that choice away from me. My 2 children are worried about going back to school, where most fellow students might likely be unmasked. This is causing anxiety in them. How will they be able to learn if they're constantly worried about the air they're breathing, unmasked classmates getting too close to them, or if an unmasked classmate coughs or sneezes next to them only 3 feet away? I believe there needs to be a compromise by providing an alternative option for the upcoming school year at the elementary level. Since remote learning is off the table, I propose having at least 1 class in each grade level at each elementary school be designated a mask-only class. Parents would be able to contact the principal at their school to volunteer their children for this class. Masks would be worn throughout the entire year, even when vaccine becomes available. This solution would put children and parents at ease. It will reduce the anxiety of children knowing they will be in a safe environment with like-minded classmates. I believe this will appeal to families in the district that are worried about sending their children back to school with the optional mask rule. By giving parents this choice, it puts the decision back in our children's hands, back into our health of our children back in our hands instead of the school board. Thank you.
Thank you. That concludes citizens' comments. Do I have a motion to adjourn to closed session for the purposes of the appointment, employment, compensation, discipline, performance, or dismissal of specific employees, specific individuals who serve as an independent contractor in a park, recreational, or educational setting, or specific volunteers of the public body or legal counsel for the public body, including hearing testimony on a complaint lodged against an employee, a specific individual who serves as an independent contractor in a park, recreational, or educational setting, or a volunteer of the public body against legal counsel for the public body to determine its validity.
So moved.
Second.
Thank you. Ms. Marcian, roll please.
Mrs. Fairgrave,
Yes.
Mr. Lackner,
Yes.
Mrs. McCabe,
Yes.
Mr. McNally,
Yes.
Mrs. Bell,
Yes.
Mrs. Barker.
Yes. The D303 School Board has adjourned to closed session at 5:20, July 22nd, 2021. We are now disconnecting with Ms. Bell.
I'm gonna put this in.
Okay. You should change into your pink. We are back in open session. It is June 19th, 2021, and the time is 7:12. Ms. Marsan, roll for attendance, please.
Mr. Lackner,
Here.
Mrs. McCabe,
Here.
Mr. McNally,
Here.
Ms. Weibel's absent, Mrs. Bell, Mrs. Bell is absent. She will be joining us by Zoom shortly. Mrs. Fairgrieve
Here.
and Mrs. Barker.
Here. Our first item of business is the facility master plan for discussion. And we'll have a presentation first.
Well, thanks, everybody. It's great to see the board and administration tonight. We've been anxiously awaiting this opportunity, and thanks for making time on your agenda for us and the committee, the facility planning committee members. Tonight really marks an exciting milestone in the facility master planning process. Sure. Uh-oh. Next. And I wouldn't call this a conclusion, the presentation night. It's really a stepping stone. What you're going to hear, and mostly from committee members, is the things that they learned about facilities through the process. Some of the commitments and that the district had made was the framework for this whole process. And they're going to talk about some of the considerations that they're recommending to the board as we get towards the end of the presentation. And I think that's really the meat of this presentation, is to get to that level. But we want to give you some of the process and some of the dialogue that happened along the way, so this has some context. We're going to follow the agenda that was up. That will be really the table of contents is our agenda for tonight. And we'll touch on each of those topics. I'm going to just give an introduction to most of these so our committee members can spend time talking about what they learned, but also some of the considerations for the board. So just over a year ago, actually, it's almost been 18 months, we started a fact-finding process to really create a document that the board administration could use and share information. It was based on facts. And that document was intended to give you an idea of how your facilities are aligning with the educational commitments of the district. That same collection of information was gathered and given to the facility planning committee. They use that as basically a baseline of data to start their discussions. And what it allowed them to do is talk about where are the opportunities and where are the challenges in the districts, what's working, what's not working so well, and talk about that in the framework of what kind of considerations or needs do we need to address within the district. I will say that I'm sorry, I'll give you the cue. I will say that all the conversations at this committee took place in our meetings was always focused around the impact and the needs of students, educators, and the community members. I think they really stayed on course, as that is the core of their discussions. Next slide. Before we go any further tonight, I want to make sure we honor and recognize the committee members. Obviously, we have 3 here tonight, but there was a lot of hard work in this, and there's a lot of members. The list is up there. A special thanks to the folks that are joining us tonight. Colleen Visa, Pat Stacy, and Thomas Lentz have volunteered to present their areas of expertise from the focus group level. So they'll be speaking tonight more on the topics that were important to them along the way. But I also want to thank the entire committee. There's a lot of hard work. From the start of this process, there was over 20 meetings that took place, either at the the committee level or at the focus group levels, along with a couple nights of tours for those that want to take advantage of that. We toured the schools and really get a firsthand sense of some of the issues or challenges that they faced. The dedication and consistency and the willingness of that group to share their perspectives was amazing. They really had some thoughtful conversations along the way, and I think that drove this to give you the meaningful outcomes that you're going to hear tonight. I also want to give special thanks to some of the district leadership that were in the trenches from day one, Mrs. Carol Smith and Mr. John Baird, along with Mr. Matt Smith and his tech team. They became familiar faces, and really their involvement and an adaptation to a very non-traditional year allowed this process to be successful. So I want to thank them also. I will also thank my team. Allison Andrews is here, and Alyssa Menelacino. The two of them were at my side for the entire process, and I think they deserve a credit because it was an interesting process. We had a year of through a pandemic and still carried a long range master plan. So thank you to everybody. Let's see, next slide, please. So what launched this successfully is that the board and the administration came up with a charge statement that gave a great roadmap for the committee to take off. The items you see out here are the considerations that were given to that committee, allowed them to stay focused. All of these topics were talked about at some point in our process. They were woven into the discussions. And that really allowed this committee to stay on track and stay focused on what their intentions were to come up with a long range facility master plan. Along with that, next slide, please. One back, I'm sorry. You also gave them a charge of what's the expectations for this process. And they stayed true to form to that as well. This gave us the framework also to just know what you're expecting and to give you a deliverable end of the process, which you're going to see tonight. And I think they definitely delivered on the expectations. It was a long process and a very committed process, but I believe that the considerations are here tonight. You'll see the thoughtfulness that went into that. Strategic commitments. This is basically a reminder. This won't be a surprise for any of the board or the administration, but on the one slide forward, please. On the left side is the board's commitments. On the right side of the D303 strategic commitments, and certainly a lot of common ground between there, obviously. But this became basically the filtering or the kind of the guiding principles for the long range planning process. So everything you'll hear tonight from a need statement and a consideration somehow fits under one or many of these commitments. And I think that was important that it aligned from day one. I'm just going to give you a quick overview of the process. This should be a familiar diagram. This is our starting point and where we took off. And we always customize this process a little bit. And certainly last year we did do some adaptation. But from the standpoint of staying true to the form, I think the most important three things that come out of this process is to start with the facts. And we did that. We gave the committee a great baseline of information, but also secondly, involve diverse voices from the community. And our stakeholder group and committee members were spot on and committed to this process. And they really gave us a variety of perspectives as we talked about different topics. And then thirdly, we always want the committee to agree on what needs are we going to address. So we're not picking up solutions that have infinite solutions, because we want to make sure that we've got consensus on the needs. And that happened and brought us to a point where we could really talk about solutions in that what later here tonight. So right after we started the process in October with the long range facility planning committee, we also asked them to sign up for a focus group. And it was a chance for them to lean towards their interests and follow their passions and talk about the topics that were meaningful to them. It also broke that group into a smaller size group so they could talk a little more freely, a little more intimately about those topics and remove some of the barriers that a large group environment feels like. You guys talk about your...
I did this. CIC members, as Dan just indicated, chose a focus group of interest, learning spaces, physical conditions, and community spaces. Each of those groups met 4 times in addition to the conversations in whole group meetings about what work we had been doing within our focus group. Learning spaces looked at the district commitments relative to curricular and instructional programming needs in regards to the 5 areas listed there on our slide. All focus groups had the opportunity for presentations from both the curriculum department and the technology department in order to gain additional information. And in early December, 2 evenings were scheduled for the groups to tour 9 buildings, 6 elementary buildings, Redling Middle School, and both high schools. That opportunity in and of itself was invaluable. We were in the space that we had been talking about. We could see what we had been discussing. And this certainly helped us develop our findings and our need statements.
Follow on what Pat mentioned. So the physical conditions focus group was tasked with understanding the district's educational strategic commitments and our goals, and how that impacted our future physical asset needs. So we looked at the district's physical assets. So went on those tours, spent time with our with John and the teams, and looked at all the topic areas that you see listed up there. I'm not going to belabor that part, but we had a lot of really great findings, especially getting in those spaces where our students are doing their learning.
And then within the community spaces focus group, here we were keeping both our students and the greater community in mind. And we evaluated and collected data on our facilities to determine where deficits existed and solutions could be found and considered related to the future and current use of our athletic, our performing arts, and community activities as a partnership.
So the culmination of all the hard work at the focus group level and being able to see the buildings and understand the facts. And we had presentations from district administrators. We really tried to cover all the bases so they had a broadest understanding of what was happening and the initiatives that educational initiatives that D303 was pursuing.
So in regards to findings in space equity, we discovered that there is a disparity in the size of classroom environments in common spaces such as LRCs, community rooms, and gymnasiums. We found discrepancies in space dedicated to specific programs like music or Empower. We were interested in seeing the level of accessibility within buildings. And we looked at all of this through the lens of how this may or may not impact the learning experiences of our students. Next slide, please. In regards to grade configuration, we looked at how the district configures each level in regards to grades, as well as how the Haynes Center at that point was currently being used and what it will look like in 21-22. Next slide, please. COVID certainly had an impact on D303 technology use, but our technology department has developed a district standard so that general classrooms are equitable and specialized programs have specialized equipment. Device rotation, best practice, remote learning, and what we learned during remote learning, including things like untethering teachers, continue to be recurring initiatives or areas of exploration. In regards to early learning, we discussed the advantages of the centralized location that we currently have, which includes, but is certainly not limited to, the collaboration and broader programming that can happen there. We looked at the limitations that might exist because our current location is not geographically centralized within the district. And we also discussed current program opportunities and potential program expansions. And in regards to educational programs, this certainly speaks to the district's strategic commitment that Dan spoke of earlier to provide our students with innovative learning experiences. It includes future-ready educational spaces, flexible learning environments, innovative and authentic programs, and technology to access and help construct learning.
For space equity, our focus groups toured the schools, reviewed the building management feedback, worked with the WOLD team as well as our district personnel to review school spaces from the classroom learning environments to the gyms and the lunchrooms. We identified inequities from school to school, including room sizes, lighting, and access to daylight, LRC sizes and furnishings, as well as possible spaces for exploratory programs. We saw firsthand some of the storage and noise partition challenges faced by our staff and students. Next slide. In our tours and after meeting with district personnel, we identified a number of accessibility issues within the district that contribute to challenges for our students and staff. Notably, we have schools where significant level changes pose a safety concern or impose limits on the potential space usage. These accessibility limitations affect the ability to effectively transit equipment, materials, and students and staff throughout the buildings. Next slide, please. Our focus group learned that the district organization and how transitions are managed between facilities for enrollment and capacity using the cap and send approach. We also learned that while there is no overall enrollment decline anticipated, while there is an overall enrollment decline anticipated over the next 3 years, we are expected to see a projected increase in several elementary schools that could exceed current capacity. Our focus group found the district takes a proactive approach to security and safety by conducting audits, holding safety committee reviews with local law enforcement and fire departments, as well as utilizing findings from the Regional Office of Education. Our annual budgeting does include continuing safety improvements for buildings. Next. For our capital plan assets, as a committee, we received a crash course on the budgeting process, including gaining an understanding of the budget cycle and improvement prioritization process. We learned about the Regional Office of Education inspections and the 10-year health and life safety process. Finally, we learned about the properties the district owns within the community it serves. Next. In our final set of findings, the physical conditions focus group inquired about the sustainability and efficiency efforts that the district engages in via discussions with Wold architects and district staff. The district prioritizes operational efficiency and reviews payback cycles for any investment. An example of how the district follows this efficiency is incorporating occupancy sensors into lighting systems.
So within the community spaces focus group, we broke out our committee findings between athletics, performance arts, community activities, and partnerships. With regard to athletics, among the many findings within athletics, a few of the hot topics included the deficiency of athletic space at North High School and the impact that that has on our students' schedules and wellness, very late nights, very early mornings. We also found that inequities that exist specifically for our female athletes at the high schools, particularly the lack of space for dance and cheer practice. And we found the need for better adaptive PE space across the entire district. Next, please. Within the performing arts findings, it was interesting to learn that both of our high schools use their auditoriums, which are equitable in size and scope, but they use them to such an extent that they're rarely available for use to the greater community. However, our middle schools have no performing arts space, which is interesting considering the demand that exists at the high school levels. And of course, not all the elementary schools offer performing space either. Next. Within the community findings and the community activities, our schools clearly have a high demand needs with both our athletic and performing arts spaces, so much that our greater community and organizations outside of DO3 simply leverage availability during rare time that space is actually available. And the last, D303 has developed strong partnerships across the community with the park district, with the library and such, trying to optimize space availability. Discussions around improving availability where we can to help alleviate demand within our D303 student population includes the continued need for outside collaboration and even enhancing these partnerships where we can and should for the future.
So the findings you just heard resulted in a comprehensive list of needs. And at the point where the facility planning committee had an agreement on those needs that need to be addressed, we were able to do some option exploration. And at the marching orders of the board to the committee of Dreaming Big, we really wanted them to think out of the box. So some of the options you're going to see here, if you go to the next slide, some of them are very exclusive to a specific need, and some of the options cover many needs. But the exploration beyond this was which needs are really addressing, or which options are really addressing the needs that they felt comfortable and important to address. So we did a pros and cons of all the different options. Some of them were a little more broad-based, some of them are very specific. To whittle it down to a set of, I believe there's 13 or 14 options. After looking at how do these options really address the needs that were important to the committee, that list of options then became more of the need statements or the considerations that went into your recommendation tonight. So most of these options didn't stand as its exclusive on its own, but through the more dialogue and understanding how do these really affect the D303, we whittled it down to the considerations that you'll hear. If you go to the next one, obviously when you say think out of the box, buy them all was one of the options. But again, we had to step back and say, how is that helping or how is it solving the needs that the committee identified? The next one, here's a couple of options that really start to talk about very specific and very broad-based approach, creating a more central location for the early childhood center that addresses very specific need, but expand and renovate at each site to meet equity, accessibility, and growth. That really covered the whole spectrum of every site, and a lot of different need statements fell underneath that option. So you'll see remnants of these as you look at the considerations or hear the considerations later tonight. Really, the essence of the committee's charge, in my opinion, was to get to this point where you could prioritize the needs, develop solutions or considerations, and bring it to the board tonight. So a lot of their hard work was driven by this. And this is the longest part of the process as well, because it's important for us to get agreement on those needs and come to a consensus, because it's hard to develop options if the needs aren't well defined.
So our space equity need, in order to create learning experiences which give students equitable opportunities, the district needs to consider options for enhancing space for learning, whether through the use of extra spaces outside the classroom or of the classroom itself. Equity does not infer spaces need to be identical. Learning environments should be flexible and support student engagement, innovative learning, and safety across all buildings. Enhancements should include overall accessibility, atmosphere, lighting, furnishings, storage, technology, and size. So if you look at the considerations that follow that need, numbers 1 through 11, you'll see the first 6 here. They are all possible classroom environment renovations and or additions of new classrooms to accommodate the learning needs of all students. These considerations create more equity between classrooms and buildings or add on to make more building space. As you look at numbers 1 through 11, you'll see that each of one of them deals with a different school and its particular needs.
Pat, if I could just give a little more clarity.
Please.
One thing I wanted to mention is you look at the needs, the consideration statements tonight. The committee decided to prioritize these based on 3 levels of priority. You'll see that up in the upper right corner of the slide, but the highest priority being very high importance, but also with an urgency to that of due now. The second priority was high importance and due soon. And the third priority was moderate importance and due later. So there was not only an importance level, but also an urgency set to each of these. And you'll see these are categorized in those silos. Within that category, they also prioritize these in order. So there's a ranking as you see these come up tonight. The ranking is, this is the first ranked item or consideration within that category of very high importance. So just a little more background of, as you see these kind of unfold tonight, that is how the committee understood it and prioritized it. So there is an order to this as you see it come across tonight.
No, thank you. Go ahead, next slide. So the same space equity need, 1 through 11 was possible equity renovations and additions. The next one is equity renovations and a new elementary. This consideration involves equity renovations at existing schools, but rather than complete additions that may be needed due to displacements caused by those renovations, build a new elementary school. The other consideration, repurpose Lincoln. Due to space equity challenges age of the facility, difficulty of educator collaboration, because not all, but some of the grade levels are 1 or 2 grades, 1 or 2 sections per grade. There was discussion about how else we might use this building. Renovations would be still necessary at the other buildings. Next slide. Need this. An educational programming need. To align with the strategic commitment for innovative learning, the district should leverage best practice design aspects in creating future-ready classroom environments. This consideration involves all levels and includes adding diverse and flexible furniture, enhancing storage, and upgrading lighting in classrooms and resource areas. Another educational programming need. We need to have facilities that support students being the primary agent of their learning. To promote empowering students, the district needs to explore opportunities to create diverse spaces for collaboration, student choice, and varied learning styles. These spaces need to be flexible and adaptable to evolve with future needs. One of the considerations is collaborative spaces. We wanted to make sure that when we looked at potential renovations, that collaborative and diverse spaces and learning environments were a priority. We could certainly do renovations without one of the byproducts being a collaborative or diverse space. And so we really wanted to make sure we emphasize the importance of these areas for student choice and varied learning styles.
Also within a very high importance do now was an athletic need. In order to best implement the wellness curriculum at the elementary schools, the district needs to provide sufficient teaching stations in all elementary buildings that take enrollment and increased PE requirements into account and meet the needs of all students. Proper storage for each gym should be considered. As a consideration, various levels of gym and stage improvements should be considered at 7 of the elementary schools based on our findings. Space equity need. Priorities outlined by the building leadership teams should be considered with any building improvement initiative. Many building leadership teams' priorities are encompassed by the various need statements and addressed through the considerations. Any remaining priorities should be explored for solutions while improvements are planned at each building.
This is our accessibility need. All facilities should be fully accessible for students, staff, parents, and visitors, allowing equal opportunity to access activities and resources at the building, even if that means closing or repurposing those schools where accessibility is not financially feasible or physically possible. So the considerations for this one, Lincoln, Davis, and Wild Rose were identified as requiring fairly significant upgrades to meet this need statement. Lincoln requires a multi-level elevator, restroom renovation, and additional gymnasium construction. Davis requires renovation to the core LRC 2-story wing. Wild Rose requires renovation to the building core for elevator placement and ramps to the north wing. Additional construction would be needed for displaced music, art, classroom, mechanicals, and support spaces at Wild Rose. Okay. Redling requires renovations for improved restrooms in the special programs area, and restroom improvements are planned at each school. We can go through a couple of these other ones. These are just kind of different versions of those pieces of it. So Lincoln, multi-level elevator and renovate restrooms. Davis accessibility, significantly renovate the core. Wild Rose, significantly renovation of the core 2-story wing to introduce an elevator and stairwells along with ramps on the north floor level. Construct an addition for the displaced music classroom and mechanical. At Redling, renovate the restrooms, which serve as special programs to enhance accessibility, and then improved restrooms as improvements are planned at each school, address those restroom needs at each school. All right. Space equity need. The district needs to improve the learning resource center environments at each building to create a multifunctional and accessible space which supports diverse activities and collaboration. So for considerations for this need statement, our first one, the LRC environments in the elementary and middle schools should be renovated and refurnished to align with programmatic goals, including diverse settings, collaborative space, and flexibility. At North High School, it should be renovated and refurnished to align to the needs of the blended learning program. At East High School, some enhancement might be needed to support blended learning.
Okay. In order, back to athletic need, in order to provide adequate space to improve student wellness goals, the district should strive to create equity in available multi-purpose physical education athletic spaces between North High School and East High School. Among the considerations, the obvious consideration is the addition of a North Field House. But another option could be a North High School gym addition plus high school multi-purpose space additions at both East and North, coordinated obviously with other athletic needs improvements. The next one, sorry. Next slide. Safety and security. To improve safety and security at each high school site, the district needs to explore opportunities to phase out any remaining mobile classrooms as teaching stations as building capacity allows. For consideration, in order to accomplish this, both high schools would require the addition of new classrooms, 4 at East, 8 at North, obviously coordinated with any other renovations that might be planned. Next slide. Athletics need still in very high importance and due now. To support the physical education needs of special education students across the district should create appropriate adaptive PE spaces that include areas for equipment storage. For consideration, with all building additions which solve athletic needs, provide storage and amenities for adaptive physical education within the expansions.
For a space equity need that was identified to better support the exploratory curriculums, for example, art, music, and empower, and the student experiences within, the district should pursue opportunities to create dedicated, specialized, appropriate, and accessible environments within each school, including furniture, location, and storage capabilities. For consideration for the board, construction of additions to exclusively house the Empower program are recommended at Bell Graham, Corin, Munhall, Norton Creek, and Wild Rose. Other schools not noted can house the program in available classrooms based on current utilization. The additional consideration, the board should consider band and orchestra renovations at elementary schools to provide viable spaces. These renovations could be accommodated with other renovation work. The last. So
Go back.
there we go. Appropriate, comfortable, and safe work environments should be prioritized for all D303 staff. Considerations, all schools undergoing facility improvements should enhance the staff environments that are deficient. The building leadership teams have highlighted a number of specific space improvements for consideration. The high schools need to provide equitable experiences for music and culinary arts opportunities. For board consideration, recommendation is to improve the culinary arts and music suites of both high schools.
Athletics need, the district should explore air conditioning the community rooms within elementary and gym spaces at all buildings to improve environments and extend year-round usability. In consideration for the board, the elementary buildings would require replacement of mechanical equipment serving the gyms and community rooms, while at both the middle and high schools, they would only need to replace the equipment serving the gyms.
Educational programming need, the district should explore additional supervised learning environments to support or expand blended learning program and the diverse learning styles. So although this consideration is the same as was on a previous slide in collaborative spaces, the focus is different. This need focuses on blended learning, the combination of classroom learning and online learning, and making sure we are meeting this learning style as well. Capital plan assets need. For the safety of students during arrival and dismissal, the district should explore options to separate buses and parent vehicles and provide adequate drop-off queuing at all sites. So one of those considerations is to explore adjacent parcels, and this particular consideration looks at the possibility of solving some of the traffic issues at Bell Graham by using that adjacent parcel. A site traffic flow consideration. Most of the building leadership teams that met probably 18 months ago expressed concerns about the parking and traffic and pedestrian safety during both pickup and drop off. Each school has its own unique circumstances, so further study would need to be done in order to understand how to solve these concerns. Sorry. The district should explore additional supervised learning environments. That is not the same slide. Hold on. District facilities need to be explored for physical modifications to reduce congestion issues at building corridors. So there's three, we're not on the right slide. Yeah, the capital plan assets need. I think forward. And forward one more time, maybe. One more time. That's it. Thank you. District facilities need to be explored for physical modifications to reduce congestion issues at building corridors. So we looked at three different locations, the North High School bypass or strangler, I don't know really what we call it. Elementary corridors and specifically East High School corridors. And for each of these considerations, we're dealing with crowded hallway spaces, either renovating them to make them less congested, as you might do at North High School, or reclaiming them as hallways as opposed to student learning spaces as you would see at East High School. And all of this would be done while other renovations and additions were being worked on. Next slide, please. District facilities need to be thermally efficient while also improving daylight conditions into learning environments. Some of this falls under the capital improvement plan, but this enhancement to the learning environment should be part of what is addressed when other building improvements are made. Next slide, please. In order to provide access for students living in all attendance areas, the district should explore the opportunity to create a pre-K location or locations that allows for greater geographic accessibility. So two possibilities on this slide. The Early Childhood Center moved to a new or a repurposed facility, or the Early Childhood Center moved to the Haynes Center. And both of these considerations deal with moving the Early Childhood Center in its entirety to a centralized location, whether that's a new building or a repurposed building such as Haynes. Having two locations is also a possibility. Understanding that displacement of current programs would also need to be considered. And then next slide, please. Oops, nope. Yep. Another consideration is early childhood to Richmond and add to Davis. This involves moving the Early Childhood Center to current Richmond building and relocating those current Richmond students to Davis. This consideration would require the need for major renovations at Davis. And then the last one is the Early Childhood Center to a new elementary school. If a new elementary school that we had talked about as a consideration for space equity needs is built, it would be possible to move the early childhood to this location either in its entirety or as a second location.
So the needs that Pat just read, as long as this one have now entered the, as you notice, the moderate importance category. For the athletics need, we are in order to accommodate the needs of physical education classes and student athletes, the district needs to explore increasing the capacity of the high school locker rooms and varsity team locker rooms. As far as consideration, expanding both the boys and girls locker rooms and both high schools, at both high schools, and renovate the existing ones to maximize space. This, of course, would be coordinated with any other expansions if possible.
So our moderate important due later grade configuration need that was identified. As a centralized facility, the Haynes Center should be explored for remote learning, professional development, and other programmatic opportunities within the district. Some consideration for the board, modernize the classroom wing of the Haynes Center to provide flexible learning spaces and support for district learning opportunities. Get the next one here. The district should explore opportunities to remove operable partitions in order to improve sound isolation between learning environments, particularly at the elementary schools. We found that these weren't being used, so replace the operable partitions at Belgraham, Corin, Davis, Norton Creek, Wild Rose, and Redling with insulated solid walls and include teaching amenities and power access to make those usable teaching. Athletic needs, in order to accommodate the practice and scheduling needs of students, athletes, community members, and increase usability such as weather resistance, availability, drainage, the district should consider improvements to the exterior field spaces. For consideration, consider upgrading the practice fields to synthetic turf to expand usability by physical education classes, athletics, and community use, or improve the natural turf practice fields.
Another athletics need, parking lot improvements and quantity of available spaces need to support enrollment and peak athletic events. We thought it was pretty clear to anyone that comes to nearly all of our schools during the school year or attends evening events, expanded parking should be explored, specifically at all elementary schools, at Redling for staff purposes, and at North, both needing additional parking and satisfying drainage requirements on the southeast side of the school.
So there's a series of need statements that really didn't require a solution. The committee deemed that these should just be initiatives or actions that continue as they are. So basically keep doing what you're doing. Just to highlight a couple, the district should maintain grade configurations currently established to minimize transitions. Just an example of one of those ongoing need statements. Next slide, please. Another example, the district should continue to review enrollment projections and program placements with consideration of best practice for total student count and class size, and in an effort to minimize disruption of students and staffs. So this is obviously, enrollment is always something you want to be tracking very closely because it can have impacts in a one-year time frame. And I'm sure since we've had a non-traditional year last year that the enrollments could have see some fluctuations going into the next couple school years that maybe were a little more unpredictable. Next slide. Last one, this one was the district should continue to explore and leverage available community partnerships to provide opportunities and experience valued by all. So just another thing that district's doing really well, just keep on doing it is basically the message from the committee. The last slide was really created based on the curiosity of the committee. Might be a little hard to read, but what the committee was interested in knowing is after they've prioritized these need statements and these considerations, where are the overlaps or the efficiencies between different possibilities or considerations? Some of them might be further down the list, but the flow chart that we created was basically to categorize these in the three importance levels, but then show how certain things could be tied together. For instance, if you're doing equity improvements at all the elementary schools or any of the buildings, you might start to pack in the collaborative spaces consideration, the BLT or the building leadership team priorities. Some of those things would naturally drift into those improvements. So you'd be getting an economy of scale of addressing more than just the one consideration or need statement. So this was done as a kind of graphically show the committee how these things might connect, but also to share with the board that there are some possibilities that there's some definite synergies between different need statements that may cross lines of importance to benefit as a whole. So that is concludes our presentation tonight. Certainly open for questions. And as I said at the beginning, we really feel this is a milestone along the way. And we know there's going to be further conversations and the next steps for the board to maybe ask more questions. I know the committee has volunteered, not just the 3 individuals tonight, but they have volunteered the time to continue the process if the board sees fit to ask some questions and put them back into a meeting mode. They're certainly willing to do so. So thank you for the time tonight.
Well, thank you very much. This is a lengthy report and full of helpful information that I know that we might have some questions about. So whoever is ready first.
I'll start, and I'll start by thanking you all. Mrs. Barker and I had the privilege of sitting in individually during your meetings, and I know they were very comprehensive. I think voices were heard. There were some meetings that went smoother than others. Some were in person and some were Zoom. So you really had quite a time, and very appreciative. And this is a comprehensive report that's something we'll probably need to be talking about for a while. There are a couple of questions I have, and they aren't really nicely layered. For some of these, well, first of all, I'm glad that we don't have everything due now, because I know there was one point in your work where everything was to be done immediately. But I do, and I think when the community starts to look at it, it could, things that may say due later, they may say, no, that's my school, I want it done now. So it kind of depends on which, where you sit. So I was wondering, some of them feel like low hanging fruit. And would you, as a committee, and this may not be low, and I can feel Mr. Baird's eyes on my head, but for instance, the traffic patterns, even though it wasn't due now, but some of those could be done now without having to worry about renovation. Is that something you all considered, or that some things could be done now, even if they were a low priority? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, great question. To some degree, the committee was asked to prioritize these without worrying about the cost involvement for that. So if you talk about the low hanging fruit, sometimes it's easy to gravitate to those things that seem like they're easy and not very costly. But we wanted to make sure the committee was looking at what are the needs that should be addressed in an order, or in the order you saw ranked, versus kind of picking away at the low hanging fruit, as you mentioned. But something like that would be easy to do the studies and understand what are the solutions, what do they look like? Because we didn't take it to the level where we were creating costs for some of those site improvements. There's with storm retention, and there's a lot of layers to that. But that is something that some of these could elevate because they're easier to study. And I think that's, and I don't want to speak for the whole committee, but what else you want to add?
We definitely talked about that quite a bit, right? Especially, there were certainly things that were on here that had a higher cost factor, at least when we got some estimates, where we still said, hey, this is still really important from what we're hearing in the community and what we've seen in our findings. So we want to put it higher on the list. So that was definitely a consideration.
Oh, go ahead.
I think too, Becky, that the traffic patterns at different schools are so different. It's an individual thing, but certainly, and I'm certain, I'm sure they've already done it, working with each other. I know, I believe it's Redling who's kind of figured out some sort of system that works in that location. And so some of those things might be able to be worked out. And that was a little bit beyond our scope about how to do it, but certainly something that needed to be done.
So something the board should, I feel like we need a big, space and how it all moves together and to help. Not that the board has to make those decisions, but that it would guide our decision-making as to how that fits together.
Well, and one thing to consider too, I think, as we looked at it, is something like that could ultimately change if 2 years down the road, you end up doing a renovate, right? So then all that work you just put into low-hanging fruit could be wasted.
Right. I really appreciate, and this was something I saw when we sat in on the meetings, was your focus on equity. As we all know, equity is just being thrown around right now, but you were really looking at are the buildings accessible to all people? And it has been a conversation this district has had to look at. It was kind of important, I think, to identify those schools that really we need to address. So I appreciate that you spent the time on that. I wondered, and I do believe that I was actually here in the district. I know I was here in the district when air conditioning was put into the elementary buildings. I wondered why we didn't do the gyms. Cost?
You know what, I think it was cost. I also think it was based on, it's unfortunately, there's not a lot of gyms in Kane County and neighboring areas that are air conditioned. And they've always done it the same way. They haven't made it. One of the things that the committee found was they were talking about year-round accessible gymnasiums. They run the summer camps, but at the end of the day, they just haven't done it. So we don't have any in orders or any in King County at this time.
Oh.
They banned on that.
Okay. Because the gyms are also used as eating spaces too for some buildings, correct? Right, okay.
One of the, just as I was there when we made that decision, one of the things also was, I believe, as I recall, cost of operating, because the ceilings are so high and, movement of air and things like that. In a gym space, it's difficult to regulate temperature in a space like that. And I think that was one of the reasons. So.
Another area I wondered about in previous experience was why a performance center was put into the middle school. I know that they can come over, I think, if I understand correctly, they can come over to Haynes. But a cafetorium wasn't, I don't know, I wasn't here. I didn't know if that was something, because it sounds like it's something that we're looking to find space for.
Redling had the black box, but it, more kids, more space needed. And I don't know how that particular space is being used now. At one time it was part of a music program, but then also able to be used as performing space. And Haynes has the stage in the gym.
Mhm.
So
And I think right now the middle schools are just using the high schools, right? So when they do have a production, Redling can go right over to East. But that also gets tricky because the auditoriums are used so much at the high school level.
I did go to the library this weekend, which is, I hope you all get to. And there is a few more little spaces, but not necessarily for performance. But and my last question is, has to do more with where we are with enrollment right now. And I don't know if administration is prepared to say, because we were at one point looking at certain elementary buildings are going to be booked. They're going to be full next year, which I'm wondering, does that change the priority at all as we look at things?
So I can speak just to kind of how the enrollment patterns are following some of these recommendations. It's interesting because many of the buildings that are identified in the report, particularly the ones on the west, kind of the central and the west side of the district. So Fearson Creek and Wild Rose are both buildings that are pretty much at capacity. And so, and I think those were at least two of the 3 or 4 that I saw identified as kind of priority spaces. So I think much of what they've recommended aligns with what we're seeing in our enrollment patterns.
I'm sure I'll have more questions later, but thank you very much. I appreciate your time. You did a great job of presenting and putting this all together. It sounds like it was such an easy, smooth thing. I'm pretty impressed. Thank you.
You know, building on the elementary school discussion, there were at least 3 schools that you called out as having significant accessibility and configuration challenges. I heard Wild Rose, Davis, and Lincoln all called out as having significant challenges in this regard. And now I hear that at least one of them has a capacity constraint. Did I understand rightly that in order to alleviate any of those accessibility concerns, we would also lose capacity in those schools? Is that right?
Yes, for the most part, especially at Davis and Wild Rose, to renovate space to really create a core that allows that accessibility, you would give up some of teaching station or teaching space to do so. So it would either incur decreasing your teaching station area or adding on to supplement that lost space.
I know it wasn't exactly in the charter, but as you guys thought about the fleet as a whole of the elementary schools, I saw some of the options associated with, repurposing or shifting populations and teaching stations around. Is there a set of comments that you would offer about the fleet of those elementary schools as a whole? So we've talked specifically about a couple of buildings that have challenges, but if I thought about the capacity as well as the facilities across that fleet of elementary schools, are there any observations you'd share?
Yeah, as a whole, because the enrollment decline on one side of the district is different than some of the growth on the other side. But as a whole, there looked to be capacity within the district to house what was speculated as the upcoming enrollment for at least 2 to 3 years. But again, the challenge with that is that where the growth was and the space wasn't, would require shifting kids onto other buildings. But from a general standpoint, enrollment wise across the entire fleet of elementary schools, the capacity exists. Now, if you start adding things like empower spaces and taking away some of those teaching stations or creating more equitable classroom sizes, you start losing teaching stations out of that formula as well. So then that changes it. But as a status quo, yes, there's capacity elementary wide.
It feels like one of the next steps we'll have to take is to look at the changes that would drive accessibility and program availability within those facilities minus the capacity, and then almost rebalance the fleet based on a view of how much capacity those buildings could maintain once the changes were made within them. Is that about right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And what kind of addition or growth could happen to help offset that too.
I just want to mention for those members of the board that weren't here then or that, or have joined the board since then, in the previous facility study and really a referendum that happened in the mid 2000s, both Wild Rose and Davis were identified as facilities that had significant challenges and were actually planned or part of the referendum was to actually replace those buildings with new buildings. So they're still here and we still have some of the same challenges with both of the schools. So I think it was important that the team to note that the team also still thinks that those are buildings that are challenges for us. And with Wild Rose, I mean, I think the other thing we know is that our community really values neighborhood schools. And so where our schools are located are in neighborhoods where for the most part, we want them to be. And Wild Rose is one of those places that, in addition to having some facility challenges is also a full building. So, there are lots of families and lots of children in that community that need a building. So those are all part of the kind of continuum of things that we need to consider as we look at some of these options.
I kind of want to add on to, as we talked about Richmond, Davis, and you talked about Davis requiring some major renovations. Should we move Richmond students there and make Richmond essentially the central location, which is more central, obviously, than the current location for early childhood? What about the cost of renovations then to Richmond? Would that be significant or? Would that be more so than other schools, or would that maybe less so than other schools?
I would say that Richmond is almost ready-made for to be able to take another program of any age group into that building. The classrooms are sufficiently sized and they're very equitable across the board in that building. The one thing that we would look at is just because of that age level, there's different exiting requirements. So that might be one of the renovations that go along with it, but that wouldn't be significant. We didn't analyze only because we didn't get into such a solution orientation where we're trying to quantify what does this mean for every building. But I would say that as the committee identified that as a possible option, that you certainly, it made sense from a building acceptability to put early childhood there, that would work. Your significant cost would be taking the Richmond kids and creating a Davis Richmond single campus.
Yeah, I know that there's one wing of Richmond that does seem like it's almost tailor-made for early childhood. So I guess adding on to that, we had talked a couple years ago when there were discussions about the fate of Lincoln. We had talked about repurposing that space or doing work on that space would trigger some additional OSHA requirements, access and things like that, handicap access and things. What about that as far as the Davis building? I know I kind of jumped from one to the other, but were we to explore that possibility, would there be those kinds of issues with the Davis building?
Well, Davis as a repurpose, if you had to do things to that building to create another space for it or a different type of purpose, you would have the same accessibility challenges. The challenge with Davis is that all those split level classrooms in that one wing need an access point to every single doorway, and that up and down. So it really doesn't lend itself to a single elevator location. You basically, what we looked at and shared some concept costs with the committee was putting a floor in and basically creating 2 floors there, and still need an elevator. So the repurposing, whatever you do from a standpoint of repurposing any of your buildings, the accessibility issues will still be lingering.
And I think, on that one, when we saw the costs and stuff on that one, I think we said, well, let's just tear down that wing and build a new, better wing. I mean, it was that significant, I think, when you shared that with us.
And that prompted the idea of possibly sharing that campus with Davis and Richmond as a single building, because kind of effort you'd put in or dollars just to update that one wing.
I had a question that kind of jumped off of that one. So with Davis and I noticed you had a very high importance. One of the items was potentially to construct a new elementary school. Was there a location for this idea, or was this just a new one anywhere? I mean, what was it really trying to cover at that point?
The little bit we did talk about location wise, because the districts from an asset standpoint, really the only property you have currently would be from a fresh start standpoint would be the Silver Glen property. It appears that there is space on the Davis property and behind Wild Rose that you could expand or use some of that space for an elementary building. But we didn't get into a lot of detail on that. The one thing we did talk about is it likely would be anchored on the west side of the district, just because that's where the population growth was.
And that would allow construction and not disturb the education going on in the school buildings at the time, right?
Correct. That's one advantage of that.
So if that location were to move, and I'm sure that hasn't been considered yet, but that would certainly affect a significant number of people as to where they'd be going to school. So I know there's a big logistic problem there. Sort of on the Davis, because there are mobiles there. I just heard, so I'm thinking about mobiles. You had mentioned mobiles being removed, and it kind of was stated as classrooms. Does that mean mobiles being removed completely, or just repurposing those mobiles for some other, for office space or?
And if I'm not mistaken, are you talking about the high school, the two high school mobile classrooms?
Well,
or
I'm talking
Davis
really
specific?
about mobiles
Just
anywhere in the
generally?
district.
Okay.
My,
At the two high schools, the main concern was the security breach that those have, and as well as there's some convenience issues, but the fact that the students have to leave the building, go out to the mobiles. So they're, as teaching stations, that activity is going on throughout the day. At Davis, those mobiles aren't being used for student use right now. So they have a little different purpose on that side. I think it's storage and maybe some office space right now. I'm not sure if there's even office space, just storage. But from a standpoint of, if you were to do something at Davis, that's prime real estate to expand to the back of that site. So it would probably be a default of moving those mobiles to accommodate doing something new at Davis. But Davis was not cited as necessarily a safety security issue like the two high schools.
I had another thought. Some of our buildings have been added on to, like, what comes to mind right away is Wasco, Munn Hall, and Anderson. Did you look at that adding on and what that impact has to the space? They weren't mentioned as equitable accessibility, but knowing some of those buildings, you could roll down hills and ski down hallways. So I'm wondering.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So we looked at it, adding additions to those buildings if you're to create equity where spaces need to get larger within the building to be equitable, not just within that building, but elementary wide. That would basically trigger the need to add some additional space. So if I'm understanding your question, Ms. McCabe, we're looking at additions there's some of the states are much more constrained than others, but adding space to basically balloon some space within the building so they don't feel like they're smaller educational environments as much as you can. I mean, one of the caveats of the equity discussions we had was that it was more to get equitable learning experiences, not necessarily identical spaces. And so there was some thought, our study, or just doing some test fits to that, was really looking at how do you make spaces equal as a starting point. But there's certainly some hybrids of that where you can start looking, how do we open up parts of that building to create different learning experiences, but on par with the other buildings that had some of that already. I don't know if that answers your question.
But it was, I guess I was looking to see how you saw it. And it may just be part of a conversation as we go along.
Ms. McCabe, a number of the options that we explored looked at additions to each of the buildings. Option N is the main one that we looked at, that had, essentially saying if we had all the equitable spaces and solve for the accessibility and everything else, what does that look like? How many teaching stations get displaced? What do we need to do? I think when we looked at East, right? East had like a whole 16 additional classrooms, like a whole additional wing that we had to add on. So in the options that we have and that we put out there, that those are in there. We didn't slice and dice it every single way, obviously, as Dan said, but there's a lot there.
I assume we're going to talk about next steps. Okay.
Yeah, I'm just trying to make sure I've answered. I think there's quite a bit here that I think we all need to, you have one more? Okay.
One more. You talk a lot about the athletic facilities, and in the community use section, we have some spaces that we work collaboratively with the Park District around today. And as we talk about the North High School, did you guys happen to explore with the Park District their interest in collaborating around the planning for potential shared use spaces?
Yeah, the Park District actually were members of our committee, at least for most of the process. And of course, they would love to have district property that they could leverage to have more park. I think the collaboration is.
I'm not
maybe
sure that's the part
financial
of collaboration that I was interested in.
Who's bringing the pot of money to the table? That might be more of the question, but I think that they are certainly willing to look at maybe being a more involved participant in that. I can't tell you what their threshold is, but they were at the meetings and very interested in the discussions around those. And it was driven by equity, but certainly they create space that can house more athletic events.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think they're in the mindset that we would love to have more space. How do we do it? And how do we get there? Because as of right now, it doesn't appear that they have a solution or we have a solution for them just because of where we are with limited space.
Okay. So I think there's a lot to chew on here. I want to talk about process. How would the board, when and how would the board like to see this come back? How are we wanting to begin these discussions? Because it's not going to be a one and done, I think, right? It's going to be several times.
My thought, I would be interested in what the district leadership team, their thoughts are in terms of all of these considerations. What would your recommendations be?
Yeah. So I think there are really two pieces that I think the board needs to see. One is, and I'm just going to call it bundling. I think what we need to do is potentially come back with some bundles of things that we think, and I think this chart actually kind of captures some of the pieces. But as we think about all of the pieces that have been put on the table and we start to put them together, how would we as an administrative team and working with the architects bundle some of these projects? So for efficiency, but also to respond to some in the do nows, there are some immediate needs that we have as a district. Some of these things we've been kind of holding off on to wait for the recommendation from the facility master plan teams. So I think it would be important for us to kind of organize it maybe in a little bit of a different way so that you could see it packaged that way. I think the other piece that is critical for you as a board is to kind of think about the available money that we have to do some of this work. We've been working with PMA, who helps manage our bonds and some of those pieces to just think about what revenue you have to do some of this work, because we can package it based on the available money. I think one of the things that we started this process kind of under a guiding principle was that we really were not looking to go to referendum, but we were hoping that we could do it through a kind of a traditional facility improvement process over the next 10 years or so within the constraints of the revenue that we have available. So I think seeing what that is and how much it is, and then that combined with us kind of bundling some of this together for you to see it in maybe phases or a step-by-step process, I think would be helpful if we could kind of walk through that process. So that would be my recommendation as far as next steps. Hear the financial piece, and then potentially look at how we might package this in a flow chart.
One of the things I know that I think that's a great idea, make it easier. I know in one of the meetings that I was listening into, the need for wanting more community involvement or input in that. So I think it would be important for us to be sure that as we do this unpacking of the bundles or whatever, that people know we're going to take it to another level as well. The CAC and Facilities Committee is made up of community people, but they also felt that more understanding of what would be presented would be really critical in getting their feedback. Having sat through, the possibilities of schools closing and redistricting and all the things that go into it, the more we're able to have ahead, being proactive so people know why and what. I think we have a unique opportunity because we're not having to do a referendum, we can spend some significant time. Does that make sense to you, Dr. Pierce?
Absolutely. And I think there would be several opportunities or through the process for some community voice, particularly in some of the decisions about new facilities or additions as well. So I would certainly echo that.
There were some really insightful points around the physical environment in the classrooms as they are today, around lighting and HVAC and a couple of those other elements. When we start to think about the bundles of these concepts, one thing we might want to try to consider is how do early stage investments in those kinds of improvements positively impact the learning environment and academic outcomes. And as we think about the bundles, that's an important piece, and the staging of those to drive the soonest positive learning environment impacts might be a guiding principle, that as we think about those bundles, how do we get the most positive output early could be a key consideration for us.
I think what I really appreciated was that the strategic commitments were kind of your guiding pieces. And so that's something that helps us in terms of looking to where are we going. We all know that boards make decisions that impact these kinds of decisions that will impact generations 50 years into the future. You go into buildings where in the early 70s, everything was open classroom, and now you want to close them all up, or buildings like this one where we don't want any windows because we don't want the energy to go out. So it's kind of a place where you are in the time zone you're in, and yet you're projecting to children who are generations from being born. So it's really a fascinating process.
Okay, any other thoughts? When do you think that we should begin discussion?
So I think the financial piece we've kind of been waiting to bring to you. We would like to bring that very soon, perhaps as soon as August Business Services. I'm looking at Mr. Attaway because I think that that's a lens that you're going to want to have. There's also some timing questions with that. We have some bonds that are, we're about to pay off. And so I think that there's some opportunity windows that I think as you're planning as a board for your timing for some of these improvements, you want to know kind of what revenue do we have available and when to help with that. And then, so I think that would be the first step. We probably would have that conversation initially. And I would say probably by October, we could have some ideas for you about the bundling. So maybe August finances, October, a potential kind of progression that you can begin to discuss. It will take a little bit of time to kind of put all of that together and repackage it, but I'm looking at Dan. What do you think about that October date?
Yeah, that we can make that work.
Yeah.
How does that impact because I think in August, we're also going to talk about the next steps for CAC to focus on. Do you feel the need for them to continue, or a smaller group to continue the facilities work, or can we thank them for all their hard work and go on to the next issue that we need to address?
Well, at a minimum, I would keep the facility committee informed. And certainly if you're talking about finance and bundling, because we took a very high level approach at the finance piece of this because we didn't want the committee to get bogged down, and they don't have control of the purse string. So it wasn't something that we talked deeply about. But I think if you are bringing that information forward, I'm sure there'll be avid listeners, but I would want to have them at least to understand how you start bundling these and what the timing is and how it aligns with a lot of the considerations that they put forth.
And I would echo that. I mean, I think they've built a tremendous amount of knowledge about our district facilities through the process, and certainly having their thinking and their the background that they have that they've gained through the process will be important as we think about it. So if nothing else, perhaps it's that we kind of talk with them and a couple of meetings to kind of say, this is the direction we're going based on the feedback that you've provided. Give us some additional thoughts.
Okay. Anything else? No? Okay, then I guess we will move on. Thank you so much for presenting here tonight.
I'll thank my peers here because they did a fabulous job. A lot of hard work.
And we delayed you a month or two there too. So thank you for being patient with us.
Okay, that brings us up for our only action item, which is the approval of the U of I Shield Illinois Test Intergovernmental Agreement. Do I have a motion to approve?
So moved.
Second.
Thank you. Do we have discussion on it?
I had a couple of questions about the service providers that are referenced in the contract and who those service providers are and who selects them and how they end up here on our campuses.
I learned some more about that just today. Our company that we've been assigned is called MedCal. I talked with their coordinator just this afternoon. We have a setup meeting with them next week. So in terms of how they actually do the work, I don't have much detail on that yet. Other than assuming you approve the contract tonight, they're sending 2 pallets worth of stuff to Peck Road in the next couple days. The university selects the providers and it's their choice. What was nice, what I was pleased to hear is that the person who at MedCal connects to the university actually lives in St. Charles. So we do have a community connection again to the person. I'm not sure I answered all of those questions. Okay.
We've heard about the level 39 versus 35. Can you speak to that at all?
A little bit. So a concerned citizen sent a document today that came from Yale Medicine. And what it says on the last page is for diagnostic testing in the community, delays in it. I'm skipping. Higher CT values at diagnosis, not reporting positive results greater than 30 would be a disservice to these patients. So what I understand about the CT level is it's the cycles the sample goes through to amplify the DNA or RNA in the sample. So the higher the number, the more cycles it's using to get the sample out of whatever it's sampling. So in other words, more sensitive. The document from Yale, the way I read it, says a higher value clearly is more sensitive, but you actually want that because you want to find the cases. Our goal is to identify cases. And a lower number would not meet that purpose. That would be a layperson's explanation.
So what is the concern about going beyond, what was, I'm sorry, 39?
I think so. The test that Shield invented apparently uses a cycle value of 39. Somebody mentioned in citizens' comments at the last meeting that if you go over a value of 30 or 35, you're too sensitive. You may be pulling too much information, which might result in false positives. But this Yale's document, in my reading, shows that until you get to 40, that's not a terrible concern.
Okay. Any other questions? No? Okay, then. Let's the roll, please.
Mrs. McCabe,
Yes.
Mr. McNally,
Yes.
Mrs. Bell,
Yes.
Mrs. Fairgrave,
Yes.
Mr. Lackner,
No.
Mrs. Barker,
Yes. Okay, motion passes 5-1. Forgot how many people we have here. Okay, do we have any citizens' comments?
I don't think we have any citizens left, even if we did.
Just in case. Someone went to the restroom. Okay, then. May I have a motion to adjourn the special meeting of the board?
So moved.
Do I have a second?
Second.
Thank you. Ms. Marcy on the roll.
Mr. McNally,
Yes.
Mrs. Bell,
Yes.
Mrs. Fairgrave,
Yes.
Mr. Lackner,
Yes.
Mrs. McCabe,
Yes.
and Mrs. Barker.
Yes, the special meeting of the CUSD 303 School Board is adjourned July 22nd, 2021 at 8:37 PM.